In the event that you are not as deeply involved in Jewish life and the politics of the North American synagogue scene as I am, you might have missed a story that made a small splash in the press last week. Last Sunday, the members of a tiny congregation in Chicago made the news when they voted to modify their charter and affirm that the core values for which the congregation stands would now include an institutional commitment to anti-Zionism. So this congregation, let me be clear, affirmed not a commitment to non-Zionism, which would mean that they chose not to take a particular stance one way or another about the Jewish value of political autonomy, but instead actively and affirmatively anti-Zionism, meaning that they will now be formally positioning themselves against the idea of Jewish self-governance and self-determination in an independent state of Israel. The results of that vote meant that the little congregation in Chicago has now become the first synagogue in modern America to take such a step. And it places them in a small minority among their peers, since we know from recent polls of the Jewish community that more than 90% of us affirm Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which is the most fundamental tenet of modern Zionism. But before that question was effectively settled in the middle of the 20th century, the debate about whether Zionism should be a primary Jewish value was quite an active one. That question was pressing and urgent in the minds of our predecessors for a very long time. It drove rifts through the Jewish communities of Europe and North America at the end of the 19th century. And as many of us know, it also played a significant role in the founding of this congregation in 1944. Hold that thought, because I want to talk about the chapters of the book of Leviticus that we read in this week's Torah portion. The Parsha describes the details of a bizarre and little-known ritual for the purification of a leper in the ancient Israelites' wilderness settlements. When the leper is determined to be clear of physical symptoms, he goes to notify the priest, and the priest takes 2 birds and brings them to the altar inside the tabernacle. The first bird is killed, slaughtered there before the altar, and its blood is collected in a clay bowl. But the second bird is kept alive, and the priest holds that bird, trembling in his hands, and he dips it gently into the bowl, marking its feathers with the blood of its counterpart. And then the priest goes back outside and sets the bird free, watches it fly away above the tops of the trees, growing smaller and smaller until it is gone. It is such a strange ritual, that ceremony of the birds. The text never tells us why it's supposed to be done in this way, what it's expected to accomplish for the leper or for the community in which he makes his home. We're not told what's meant to be symbolized by the dead bird or by the living one that flies away to freedom. And so we don't know for certain what it is meant to teach us today after all the centuries that have passed since those words were written about wholeness and recovery, about alienation and a return to home. This week, when I was reflecting on the portion, I wondered whether and how we are invited to see ourselves in the ritual of the 2 birds. Does the living bird represent God's mercy, perhaps, and the dead one, the strictness of God's judgment? Maybe the dead bird is meant to be seen as more beloved by God, representing the willingness to sacrifice everything one has for the sake of God and religious community. Or maybe the living bird is the more favored one, standing for the value of freedom and an escape from peril. One of the books I read over the summer was the extraordinary collection of essays by Dara Horn that was published last year. The book is fantastic, but its title, as many of you know, as I'm watching you nod with recognition, was provocative enough that I got into the habit of removing the dust jacket before I pulled it out to read it in public. Because the book is titled, People Love Dead Jews. The 12 essays in the collection are on a variety of subjects, but what they have in common is Horn's hypothesis that to much of the outside world, what is most appealing about the Jewish community is not our traditions or our customs or our survival, but instead the way in which Jewish suffering and Jewish tragedy serves as a compelling and even romantic metaphor about the delicate intertwining of faith and tragedy. In other words, her assertion is that the symbolic value of the Jewish people is like that of the dead bird on the altar, a beautiful bundle of wings and feathers that can no longer fly, but which have been offered up in the ultimate gesture of martyrdom and sacrifice. But what we know now is that the pivotal moment in Jewish history came when we were given for the first time the opportunity to see that we don't have to be the dead bird on the altar, atoning for the rest of the world's sins. We can be the other bird, the one that flies off, traumatized and bloodied but free. Jewish existence need not and should not represent victimhood or objectification, but freedom. So if I can turn from the ancient stories of our Torah portion to the more modern stories of Jewish life today, this is, to me, what it means to be a modern Zionist. To recognize and cherish and hold fast to the idea that Jewish autonomy in the political world is a good thing, that it's not merely permissible but desirable for our people to put an end to the sort of Jewish identity that's forged by moving through life as someone else's subject or someone else's victim, and instead to begin living as a free and independent actor in the world's history. The anti-Zionist principles expressed by that congregation and others are rooted in the assertion that Israel's legitimacy as a modern nation is undermined irreversibly by the state's moral failings. Now, it is fair and it's appropriate to identify the ways in which any modern state fails to live up to its own standards, Israel included. It's fair and appropriate to do that for any nation because no modern nation always succeeds in living up to the standards it sets for itself. But moral failings and political shortcomings do not disqualify any nation from deserving freedom and independence. When we look across the sea at Israel and see examples of corruption or crime, if we witness public policy decisions made by a democratically elected government that we might wish had been done differently, what we're seeing is not evidence that it should be revoked from the community of nations, but instead proof that the Jewish state is, for better and for worse, a modern state like every other. David Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli prime minister, is famous for having said, this is his quote, "We will know that Israel has finally become a normal country when Jewish thieves and Jewish prostitutes conduct their business in Hebrew." This is what it means to be a real nation in the real world, grappling with the tension between freedom and responsibility, between secular democracy and the centuries-old demands of Jewish law. It would be nice if modern political life didn't require that sort of stretching between the details of power and conflict and the principles of justice, nonviolence, and freedom. It would be nice. But that's not the world in which any of us live today. In today's world, flawed states exist and aren't going anywhere. But to hold the ideology that any one of those legitimate states should disappear is to harbor a hope that something unimaginable will happen to the millions of people who call it home. And speaking of home, one final word about this week's Torah portion. Because at its core, the story about the very strange ritual of the birds is about recovery and coming home. The main character in the story is the leper, that stigmatized and alienated character who is finally, lovingly, and compassionately reintegrated into the heart of his community, because what he longs for most, we can read between the lines of this story, is the same thing every human longs for, a place where we can come home. Our goal as modern, progressive Jews is not to seek our home in the charred ashes of immolation for a noble death on the altar. And we should not be apologetic or embarrassed about rejecting that fate. Instead, our task is to continue yearning for the fate of that second bird, the one that lives, the one whose heart longs for flight, even with blood on its wings, its tiny heart drumming with desire to return to the sky where it belongs. I think about that ancient priest thousands of years ago who stepped outside of the holy tabernacle to release the bird, and what he might have thought when he watched it go, frantically flying away above the trees. He wasn't thinking about statecraft or foreign policy or political independence or anything like that. What he was thinking about was what he saw in its wings, the thing that all of us feel beating inside ourselves, the rhythm of flight, beating time with our hearts, the place in which hatikva, the hope, stirs for a place we can call home. Shabbat shalom, everybody.